Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and the Acolyte is over. And, while I have to say the Acolyte had some issues here and there, what I really enjoyed about the show was how they ultimately portrayed the Jedi Order. And listen, I know a lot of you guys are like, they made the Jedi bad because of Master Soul and Endara, but, please take a step back, hear me out for a second. Okay? Well, some part of the show might seem clunky and simplistic. At the core of the Acolytes is an extremely complex moral dilemma. And no, we're not talking about what Master Soul and the Brundok 4 did. That's a little bit more clear-cut. We'll talk about that in the next video. No, instead, I'm talking about Vernestra Rwoh, who serves as one of the sub-leaders of the Jedi Order. We've done several videos about her so far, and we've talked about how she potentially could be evil. I talked about how her experiences being over a century old has made her jaded and fearful in her position of power. And we all theorized together that that scar on Kymer's back was probably from a lightsaber whip. So high five, guys, if you got that right, because we got that right together. And, I don't know if it's actually a good thing if idiots like me are making predictions that might say something kind of negative about the show itself. But upon further examination, I don't actually think Vernestra Rwoh is wrong for doing what she did. And it all kind of starts with this little side plot of one of the Jedi-friendly senators warning her about a incoming audit from the Senate.
My colleagues in the expansion region will vote in favor of an external review of the Order.
Rancourt has never been a friend of the Jedi.
Now, initially, we really liked this idea of an external review. We actually did an entire video where we talked about how the internal checks and balances in the Jedi Order were clearly not working, and so you do need a third party to come in and shake things up a little bit. The entire Brundok incident is extremely problematic. You have a group of Jedi who, whether intentional or not, triggered an incident that ended up killing an entire coven of witches. We actually made a comparison between that incident and the Waco siege. I highly recommend you check that video out. It's totally not controversial. And that's because I believe that groups with a monopoly over power need to be held accountable. And the Jedi as an organization will be more healthy and free of corruption if there is an outside review of what's going on in the Order. I mean, most organizations need checks and balances. Most individuals, to a certain degree, need checks and balances, whether it's a schedule to keep you on task throughout the day, or a safety for your blaster, or just a good friend to tell you, hey, those jeans don't fit on you anymore. And if you wear them out, it could be considered a war crime in certain contexts. But then something completely changed my mind. When military forces get deployed in an operation, there's usually a media blackout. If there isn't, people have screwed up majorly, right? You're not supposed to know who's going where, how many, how much equipment they have, what their numbers are. These things are usually kept secret. We could take a look at Operation Overlord, or, the invasion in Normandy. There was a complete blackout of information before this event. As a matter of fact, there was an entire misinformation campaign known as Operation Bodyguard that was designed to mislead the Nazis. And a lot of people took part, even the media and filmmakers, right? And with the appearance of Darth Plagueis, who looks like he's in his super paranoid recluse period, like he just survived the Sargeron assassination attempt, with his appearance, things change a lot. I mean, suddenly, the Jedi aren't just some peacekeeping force that's designed to keep the galaxy safe from petty criminals and Force cults. They're actually Sith in the galaxy, right? Furthermore, when Vernestra Rwoh lands on Brundok and actually senses that Kymer is there because he took his helmet off, that leads us to have a better understanding of her intentions. We gotta rewind a little bit and take a look at some older scenes, like when, in the first episode, Vernestra Rwoh talks to Sol right after finding out about the murder of Master Endara.
If it were to become public that a former Jedi killed one of our own,
Our political enemies could use it against us.
discretion is important. Our justice swift, an example made.
She's worried. She's playing defense, and it's clear she does not trust the Senate from the very beginning. And when Master Torben fails to defend himself from himself and murders himself, here's how she reacts.
I have convened a small council to discuss next steps. We are awaiting your arrival.
With respect, we don't have time for talks, Master Vernestra.
Our problem has changed. Your old Padawan going rogue was one thing, but now a trained outsider is responsible.
So two things are setting off alarm bells in her head. First, it's the appearance of an old Jedi apprentice, Osha, who turns out to be May, and then there's the appearance of a master who's behind May. She even convenes a small council to discuss matters with. Now, initially, I thought these individuals were just loyal to her, and that she had gone rogue. But now I'm beginning to realize that this was all sanctioned by the Jedi, which again changes things. When Senator Rancor, the senator who's kind of against the Jedi, confronts Vernestra Rwoh in her office, she reveals the following.
I've heard some disturbing things.
What have you heard?
That you are running a murder investigation without reporting it to the Senate.
I'm keeping this internal for the moment. I have the authority to take independent action if there's no larger threat.
And then we have that last scene where Vernestra Rwoh walks into the Grand Master's office and says this.
Sorry to disturb you, Master. We need to talk.
It's at this point it all clicked for me, okay? You see, Vernestra Rwoh is a pretty special Jedi, especially during the High Republic time. She's a really crazy background. We mentioned it briefly in previous videos, but basically she was a super gifted Jedi. She made a Jedi Knight at the age of 16, which was more or less unheard of at the time, and spent her first year as a Knight fighting in the Nile conflicts. This was a very tumultuous time period during the High Republic era. You know, all of those headaches that Vernestra Rwoh gets when traveling in hyperspace, that's most likely trauma from the Great Hyperspace Disaster, when a passenger broke up at hyperspace speeds and basically killed millions of people, including a lot of Jedi. I imagine she gets like PTSD, headaches, and migraines whenever she's back in hyperspace, because that was a terrible event for her to experience. Because remember, Jedi can sense massive amounts of death, like Kenobi did when a mining incident destroyed Alderaan. But anyway, after the events of the Nile conflict, Vernestra Rwoh becomes a Wayseeker. It's kind of like an alternative to the Baresh vow we see Master Torben take after his own traumatic experience. See, Vernestra Rwoh not only saw a lot of terrible things, she also grew disillusioned about the Jedi Order, and specifically the Senate, because a lot of the public and a lot of senators actually turned against the Jedi because of the Nile conflict. They believed that the Jedi were somehow equally responsible for all the destruction, and that actually happened a lot during the High Republic period and also during the Old Republic in Legends. It also should be noted that Senator Gira Staros betrayed the Republic and the Jedi and actually gave the Nile schematics to the Starlight Beacon space station, one of the major Jedi outposts in the Outer Rim, and those schematics played a huge part in destroying the station and pulling the Jedi back from the Outer Rim. So as you can see, Indara had enough of all of this nonsense. She was only 16, 17 years old at the time, and she became a Wayseeker. So Wayseekers are basically independent Jedi. They leave the temple. They no longer follow the orders of the High Council, but they still remain Jedi in their own way, and they try to connect and follow the Force in their own way. It's actually a really interesting concept. By the time the Clone Wars started, it was no longer something that was allowed anymore. Obi-Wan Kenobi always mentioned how Qui-Gon Jinn would have fit well with this path had it been available to him. No one really understands what Vernestra Rwoh did during this time period, but she did eventually make it back and rejoin the Jedi Order to a certain extent. Well, actually, she still seems to be pretty independent. She's almost like a Wayseeker working within the Jedi Order. Kind of like a Special Forces Jedi person, maybe like deniable ops, right? And I should also mention that she's 100 years older by the time the Acolyte starts, and in many ways, she's probably one of the most experienced Jedi in the Order when it comes to dealing with threats against the Jedi Order. And she's clearly given extra powers. She has a certain degree of autonomy. She can create her own special working groups for certain situations, and she can even talk on behalf of the Council to the Senate, right? Plus, she reports directly to Grand Master Yoda, who probably likes her because she too is green. And I think she has all of these powers because she is literally the Jedi Order's version of an Inquisitor, as in she is purposely trained and tasked with hunting down dark side Force users. In a lot of ways, she's like internal affairs. She's out there to make sure that the Jedi don't fall to the dark side. And, now that there's a Sith threat, of course, her job becomes focused on that. And after arriving on Kofar and witnessing the murder of several Jedi, well, that's when things escalate in her mind.
Something to tip the scales.
She immediately knows that there's something greater here than just a dark side Force user or an assassin. I think it's at this point she begins theorizing that a Sith Lord is active in the galaxy. When the Jedi talk about tipping of the scales, they're talking about the eternal struggle between the dark and light side, the Sith and the Jedi. Dark Jedi usually pursue more earthly things like a little bit of power, maybe some money here and there. It also should be noted that Lookout Vernestra Rwoh immediately leads Mog to think that maybe Master Soul is responsible for this massacre.
They were all killed by a lightsaber. What does that tell you?
A powerful Jedi has fallen. You don't think Master Soul was responsible.
That is quite the accusation.
Because she's fighting two battles here, right? Right now she's looking at the possibility of a Sith reemergence, but in the back of her mind, she remembers that Senator Rancor is trying to audit the Jedi Order, and so she needs to find a scapegoat for the murder of the Brendok 4, for losing this entire strike team on Kofar, right? You can't just hide that from the Senate. It's a lot of people dying. And so Master Soul, she starts to develop this theory with Master Soul. Now, I still think her pinning everything on Master Soul is ultimately wrong, but as I mentioned in our review of the show, that's the whole point. Sometimes you can't just look at things from a black and white perspective. Bad people like Chimera can occasionally do good things like abduct Osha and heal her wounds and feed her really warm and I'm guessing nutritious soup. I love soup. So if bad people can do good things in the service of evil, then I feel like good people should be able to do bad things in the service of good, right? Again, I think about our military. I think about World War II. The United States was for sure on the good side. I mean, we were fighting literal Nazis. We'd started a world war, and were vehemently focused on putting everyone they didn't like in death camps. But the United States also used strategic bombers to pulverize both Germany and Japan. I mean, the use of firebombs on the Japanese mainland did far more damage than the atomic weapons ever did. These were terrible, awful events. And, we talk about this in school in America. Like, these are things that we learn. As a country, we try to self-criticize because I think that's important for a democracy, for a quote-unquote good nation. You have to be aware of your own flaws and problems. But ultimately, you can't argue that the United States didn't do a positive thing by entering the war and defeating the Axis powers. Ultimately, war is messy, you guys. I mean, conflict is messy. People on both sides do terrible things to one another. It's just how it is.
We're almost through! Bring in the flamethrowers!
And when you mature and you have more world experience, you see more things unfold in real life. If you ever, unfortunately, are in a conflict, you'll start to notice that, most things are not black and white. They're all shades of gray. People are just trying to make decisions in very tough situations, and a lot of times people get it wrong. Good people get things wrong all the time, in my experience. And I've also seen a lot of bad people do good things. It's a confusing place, the world that we live in. And when Vernestra Rwoh looks at Senator Rancor, a lot of her past trauma and distrust of the Senate comes back. But more importantly, from a strategic point of view, Vernestra Rwoh could no more let the Senate know about the weakness, the internal problems of the Jedi Order, than the Allied High Command could let the Germans know that all the tanks they had positioned to invade Norway were actually inflatable. And you know what? We're not really sure what Senator Rancor's intentions are, but I actually, I'm going to try to take him at his word until he proves otherwise, because the things he says are pretty rational to me. In all honesty, I'm kind of biased because I've said things literally like what he's about to say here.
I think the Jedi are a massive system of unchecked power, posing as a religion. A delusional cult that claims to control the uncontrollable.
We don't control the Force.
Not the Force. Your emotions. You project an image of goodness and restraint. But it's only a matter of time before one of you snaps. And when, not if that happens, who will be strong enough to stop him?
Senator Rancor represents a very rational fear. He doesn't necessarily have to be a bad guy. Actually, there are a lot of senators in the new Disney lore that are kind of like this. Like, there's a book called Bloodlines, where basically a group of senators out Princess General Leia for being kind of a war hawk. Like, she's telling everyone, the First Order is coming, the First Order is coming, and they're like, you're a war hawk. But ultimately, these senators who call her out when they actually see the invasion happen, they kind of come together. Well, some of them do. Others join the First Order, but it's very possible that someone like Rancor, when they find out that the Sith are coming back, he might join the Jedi's side. We just don't know. But I do know in a vibrant democracy, we're not supposed to be afraid of political conflict. Like, the whole idea is to have different powerful entities fighting each other. Like, we have to accept that there is going to be corruption, and then we have to also accept that the greedy intentions of these other factions will balance each other out. I know that sounds crazy to a lot of you kids out there, but that's actually how the world works. Like, the fact that we have very divisive politics is not always a bad thing. Actually, it gets pretty scary when the entire country thinks the same thing. But what's not cool is when people go outside of the normal political routes and try to, assassinate someone. That's not cool, right? That's no longer politics. That's strongman tactics. That's using violence. And Vernestra Rwoh, well, she's very willing to play this game of politics like so many other Jedi before and after her, because she knows that there's a greater threat out there for now. Potentially a Sith Lord like Darth Plagueis. Remember, she recognized the movements of May in those holograms in her little working group meeting. She also sensed Chimera, her former student. She also probably suspects that Chimera might have a master of his own now. She has no idea if the Sith have infiltrated the Senate. I mean, the Nihil definitely infiltrated the Senate, and that caused the Jedi a whole lot of pain. And so she's kind of justified in some ways to do what she's doing right now. And so she's worried about the damage that a senator aligned with the Sith could do while carrying out an independent audit to the Jedi Order. They could be disingenuous. They could ask for the Senate to limit the Jedi's power greatly and basically handicap them so they can't actually investigate this bigger Sith threat. Now, it's clear that Vernestra Rwoh cares about the Jedi. She cares about Master Sol as a friend. And I feel like the eulogy she gives to him, it comes from the heart. Although she's giving it to a person with no memory of anything. So, I don't know.
He was a kind, brilliant, compassionate man. And he did a terrible thing.
It's true he did terrible things, just not this terrible thing. It's not very truthful what Vernestra Rwoh is doing here, but it's kind of a white lie, in my opinion. And I think in a lot of ways, Master Sol would have agreed to this. He did love the Jedi Order, faults and all. He was very ideological.
A rogue Jedi named Sol killed his accomplices to maintain the cover story. Sorry, my friend.
What would the Senate do if they found out that Vernestra Rwoh's old apprentice was now a part of the Sith, and that Master Sol's former apprentice was also training with the Sith? We talked about the Senate coming in and tying the hands of the Jedi Order and, investigating the crap out of them, but what if Darth Plagueis finds out about all of this? What if he finds out that the Jedi are onto him? See, that is the much bigger problem, right? It's clear that Vernestra Rwoh wants as much secrecy as possible in order to root out this threat. And I guess, judging by what she tells Yoda, we'll see what she truly cares about. Her own legacy concerning Chimera, or hunting down the Sith, as is her responsibility. It all depends on how much of the truth she tells Yoda. Ultimately, what is the bigger threat? A slightly corrupt Jedi Order with an individual who seems kind of like she's a rogue, or maybe that's intentionally done because she has a bit more flexibility than the rank-and-file Jedi, and she is, dealing with this very unorthodox threat. Is that a bigger threat, or is it the Sith, who are smaller in numbers, have a lot less power, but are very corrupt in what they want? Is it justified for the Jedi to take actions in their own hands because they fear the Republic has been corrupted? I mean, technically speaking, they serve the Republic, so the Senate, the people of the Republic should know about this larger threat, right? That's what Vernestra Rwoh talked about. She's allowed to keep things internal unless there is a greater threat, and there clearly is one. But if you guys have read the Darth Plagueis novel, you'll know the answer to whether the Senate is compromised or not, because, it definitely is. I, for one, really appreciate endings like this, because they're designed to really make you think. And I feel like a lot of Star Wars shows, they do dumb things down way too much so that a much larger audience can understand it. And I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with this idea of, like grayish morality, just like in real life. Like, a lot of people want to be told who's good and who's bad, and that's how a lot of bad things happen. That's how mobs start. That's how mob rule starts. That's how you have demagogues, autocrats. Like, when you kind of just give away your ability to critically think and rationalize things, and you allow someone else to think for you, that's when terrible things happen. And so, exercises like the one I'm doing right now, when we theorize about whether Vernestra Rwoh is right or wrong for doing these things, these are the things we all need to think about. It helps our critical thinking skills. And I, for one, think that it's great that the Acolyte does this. I want to see a lot more of this from Star Wars in the future. I mean, Andor does a very similar thing. Remember, guys, the Rebels aren't just completely good guys. I mean, Luthen Rael has some pretty terrible tactics. I mean, you guys remember that speech he has, right?
I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see.
That speech always gives me chills. But anyway, guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think about Vernestra Rwoh's actions here. I look forward to discussing these things. But yeah, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.